China's actions in 2020 tore up 25 years of trust between India and China. And it's going to take a long time to rebuild that trust. It's not going to happen overnight. Well, until a few months ago, there were no direct flights between India and mainland China, if you discount Hong Kong. So that shows you the level of distrust that had set in.
One concern that we hear about constantly is if India relations with China warm, or if there's more exchanges with China, does that necessarily mean that would be at the expense of relations with Taiwan? Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. As we launch into 2025, we are facing a fast evolving global political landscape. We are in the midst of a number of ongoing conflicts, most notably the war in Gaza and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, this follows a year marked by elections in nearly 70 countries, where almost half of the world's population chose their leaders, and that includes the United States and India. So, how is the world's biggest democracy navigating its foreign policy and strategy? For this and so much more, we are joined by Dhruva Jaishankar, the executive director of the think tank ORF America, joining us from Washington, D.C. He has recently published the book Vishwa Shastra, India and the World. Thank you so much for being part of the program. I just want to start with this and putting it in the most basic terms. Where does India currently stand in the world order?
Well, there are many ways of looking at that question. I would put it simply. I think we are in a period defined in some ways by a very powerful United States that remains the world's leading power, but is no longer as unrestrained as it was in the immediate post-Cold War period, and now faces stiff competition in a number of domains, particularly from the People's Republic of China, economically, militarily, in a number of other ways. You have a closer China-Russia relationship that has emerged over time, but certainly accelerated after 2014 and again after 2022. In this world where the share of the global economy while the U.S. share has remained roughly the same since the end of the Cold War, that of the U.S. alliance network, including the European Union, Japan, and others, has actually shrunk in relative terms. And so it is in this context that India has emerged after China as the sort of second largest contributor to global growth since the turn of the millennium. It is today the fifth largest economy in the world. It may soon be the third largest economy within certainly a decade, if not sooner. So I think we're in this world where, defined in some ways by growing competition between the U.S. and China, the U.S. remains very powerful within its alliance network in both the Atlantic and in the Pacific. China-Russia relations have come much closer, and India remains a sort of major, sort of a third major power, but still very far behind the United States and China, at least in terms of economic power for the foreseeable future.
I want to talk about your book, which is gaining a lot of attention for not only its breadth in looking back into India's relationships, but also kind of looking forward in what is possible for India. So what motivated you to write Vishwa Shastra, India and the World, and what should be our key takeaway from it?
Well, thank you. I was motivated to write it by a number of things. I think partly the biggest factor was I felt people in India needed a place to start. And, I mean this sort of as a casual reader who's interested in India's role in world affairs, needed a place to start that journey and start exploring India's role in the world. And so I wrote it primarily for an Indian audience. It's been published only in India so far. But I think a secondary audience certainly is people outside India who want a reasonably accurate, what I think is a reasonably accurate understanding of where India is coming from and where India is going in world affairs.
And if we look towards India's complexity, not within, but in its relations, international relations, what we're seeing is very much a growing bipolarity, particularly after the Ukraine war, where you have the U.S. and allies on one side, and on the other side you have Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all of them, growing stronger, in their alliances. But India's managed to straddle a lot of these lines of alliances. Do you think that's sustainable?
So one is, I'm not sure I would necessarily define things that way. I think in some ways we're entering into a much more post-alliance world. And let me explain what I mean by that. I think what emerged in the after World War II, during the Cold War, and particularly in the context of the nuclearization of the world, the nuclear arms race, was this idea of these blocs which have very close military ties, where you have these very firm treaty-based alliances. And the U.S. certainly entered into those kinds of arrangements with NATO, with Japan, with Australia. The Soviet Union initially did that too. But I think we are entering into a world which is going to be less defined by these very close alliances. There is not a guarantee that even close partners today are necessarily going to come to each other's aid. So I think that's going to characterize a lot of the world. And in this context, just to bring it back to India, I think we're seeing a world where India is not necessarily equivocating between them. India has major differences with China. India is entering into a closer strategic partnership with the United States, which is quite multifaceted, much deeper than it has been historically. But doing that while maintaining relations with countries like Russia and Iran that are traditionally not on the same side as the United States, obviously. So I think, the way I would characterize is we're entering into a sort of a more of a post-alliance world, and India is navigating that.
How do you think relations between India and Washington will or which direction it will head as we go into Trump 2.0?
I mean, I think so far everything indicates that it will be positive. This is a relationship that really since 1998, since the nuclear tests, India's nuclear tests, and which were immediately met by sanctions, led the U.S. And its allies imposed sanctions on India. But by 2000 and the visit of Bill Clinton to India, that started changing. And we've really seen every administration in the U.S., Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and now possibly Trump again, all contribute in various ways to strengthening that relationship, that strategic relationship, and making concrete progress in a number of areas: defense, space, critical technologies, export controls, to advance that relationship. So I think everything indicates that we will see a positive trajectory. There will be some bumps and some differences. The two immediate ones I anticipate will be on tariffs. Related to trade. India has a major trade surplus with the U.S. and on some issues related to immigration. There are also some secondary issues. A lot of that will depend on U.S.-China, U.S.-Russia relations, the Middle East, and so forth. But I would say those would be the two immediate issues. But that being said, I anticipate that we will have broadly cooperative and relations that will go forward.
Modi was prime minister in Trump's first term, and during that period we saw very much, optically anyway, a very warm relationship between the two. Do you see that continuing in this next administration?
I mean, quite possibly. I don't focus a lot on sort of the individual chemistry between leaders. I'm not saying it's not important, but ultimately these are both people who have a very strong sense of the interests of their country. And have often sparred on issues like trade in the past. So while I do think that personal chemistry is again, not insignificant, I wouldn't put too much stock in that. But I think what that does indicate is, again, in the past when the two leaders were in power at the same time, they had some experience with each other. In fact, the last foreign trip that Trump took as president was to India in February of 2020. So I do again anticipate that they will know at least how to engage with each other.
Where does India fit in the U.S.-China competition, or does it factor at all in this, given that looks like there's a very hawkish administration towards China coming in?
I think some factors. I do think that the policy towards China is not necessarily set. There are some internal differences in the incoming team about how to engage China. Certainly, a lot of the key appointees tend to, if you go back and look at their statements and their records, tend to be very skeptical of cooperation with China. In probably every major agency, including the Treasury Secretary, the U.S. Trade Representative nominee, at the Defense, at the Pentagon, at the National Security Council. But there are still some, including donors and others, who are advocating for political donors, that is, who are advocating for slightly more cooperative relations, or at least some kind of guardrails, which is what the Biden administration called it, some kind of modus vivendi, something like that with China. So I'm not sure China policy is necessarily set in stone at this point of time. And we also saw in 2017 how the Trump administration made an effort to try and engage with Xi Jinping, including a meeting at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, but then did a shift in 2017 by the late summer, which into a much more competitive posture, which defined the relationship over the next 3 years. And where does India fit into that? I think one of the things that a lot of people struggle with is analytically, and this gets back to the alliances. India is not a treaty ally of the U.S. There isn't an expectation on either side that the U.S. or India would necessarily come to each other's military assistance in the manner that the U.S. would come to a NATO ally's assistance in the event of hostilities with China. That being said, the assessments that India and the U.S. have about China, there's a great deal of overlap, even if there are differences in geography, differences in their own relationships with the People's Republic of China.
Now, if we go directly into India-China relations, we've seen what we can, I guess, describe as a thaw in relations. Probably the biggest amount of high-level exchange in 4 years since those border tensions erupted in 2020. Can you see the relations heading in that direction as we go, in the coming couple of years, given that we're also seeing China become, I would say, more protectionist or more insular in trying to control, one, its population, and two, in its expansionist endeavors?
There have been some attempts at re-engagement in the past few months. Followed by, this coincided with disengagement on a number of friction points on the disputed border, particularly the western sector in Ladakh. And this had been kind of the sore point since 2020 over the past 4 years. To just give a sense of how difficult relations were until a few months ago, there were no direct flights between India and mainland China, if you discount Hong Kong. There were no journalists from each other's countries in India and the PRC. So that shows you the level of distrust that had set in. Now, at the same time, Beijing has been making overtures and saying, India should try and normalize the relationship, not hold it hostage to the border. India was holding out. We've seen a bit of a thaw, as you said. We've seen a return, at least announced return of, for example, pilgrims across the border. But none of the structural changes have really been settled. There hasn't been a major thinning out of troops in either side on the border. A lot of China's infrastructure in Tibet is not going away. It is permanent. These are roads, railways, airstrips. This is not changing. China has not made any major changes to its posture, its nuclear development, its maritime buildup, which will have consequences for India in the Indian Ocean. And then there have been reports recently about how China seems to be dissuading its citizens from contributing to manufacturing growth in India, including, by the way, those working for Taiwanese companies. Now, all of this doesn't suggest a very cooperative reset, in relations. So I would say so far it's going to take a very long time. And in some ways, China's actions in 2020 tore up 25 years of trust between India and China. And it's going to take a long time to rebuild that trust. It's not going to happen overnight. So I do think we're at a best case scenario is a very, very slow and incremental rebuilding of that relationship.
You mentioned flights. India and Taiwan still don't have direct flights, but we have seen an uptick in the number of high-level exchanges, or mostly informal and business interests. But one concern that we hear about constantly is if India relations with China warm, or if there's more exchanges with China, does that necessarily mean that would be at the expense of relations with Taiwan?
I think that would be a very narrow way of looking at it. I think, the relationship between India and Taiwan it exists for a certain set of reasons and has its own history and its own legacy. Again, the material benefits for Taiwan and India are there to see. You have exchanges of students. You have now, a growing trade and a technological relationship. That's quite obvious. I think India's relations with China are very different. Again, have a different, for positive or negative reasons, has a very different character. So I think it would be, both India and, to be honest, Taiwan have shown the ability to engage with multiple partners at the same time. Taiwan deals with Japan and the United States and with mainland China, and has done so for many years. So I think it would be short-sighted on everyone's part to look at these as zero-sum type of relationships.
And so can you see India and Taiwan cooperate more in the technology sector, given that, there is a sense that India, and correct me if I'm wrong, is being left behind in this whole AI boom. You're seeing American and Chinese companies being indispensable in many countries now because of the advances they've made. Firstly, where is India in that? And also then, in that case, can Taiwan be a partner player for India?
Well, India has the largest number of engineers. If you look at almost every chip design company, they have a presence today in India. So if you look from a certainly at the very least from a talent point of view, India is an integral part of the global critical and emerging technology supply chain. India has provided $40 billion in subsidies to critical and emerging technologies. This represents a huge opportunity for Taiwanese companies. But I think for the most part, with some exceptions such as PSMC, they've been some of these companies have been quite risk averse in looking at the Indian market, and they also tend to be working at the higher end of the technological ladder. So they're looking more at developed economies for the market. So I think there's other set of issues again related to scale and related to price points and which distinguish India from many other places. But I do think what that suggests is actually I think Taiwanese companies and the Taiwanese polity needs to pay closer attention to some of the very significant developments taking place in the Indian tech sector as well.
All right, so let's move back to India's neighbors. Now, China over the last 10 years has established a foothold across sectors in the South Asian, what we'd call non-aligned countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and many fit in the economic arena, like with their Belt and Road. Looking in from the outside, do you feel that India has missed an opportunity to create those kinds of partnerships?
Well, let me give you the example of Sri Lanka, since you mentioned it. Sri Lanka was seen as a major part of China's Belt and Road initiatives. There were significant investments in the port sector, both Colombo and then a port called Hambantota, in airport in Hambantota, outside Hambantota as well. And yet, when COVID hit, Sri Lanka had a very significant public debt problem, and China did not accommodate, in some ways, help to refinance a lot of the debt. In fact, China played a rather difficult role in that. So I think that serves as a bit of a cautionary tale for both for what Belt and Road looks like in practice, despite some of the promises. This was touted as one of the big success stories of Belt and Road just a few years earlier. But also, it was India that extended a $4.5 billion bailout to Sri Lanka. And I think you can tell, that's a particularly extreme case, but I think you can tell a similar story elsewhere. If you look at Nepal's largest trade partners today, it's not China, it's actually India. It remains so. If you look at investment into Bangladesh, at least state-backed investment, India is the largest provider of state-backed investment to Bangladesh. Now, there's no question that today, for many of these countries, China is perhaps the second most important partner.
In a nutshell, we're into a quarter of this century. For the rest of the 21st century, what does India need to focus on for its foreign policy?
Again, I think sort of, the five priorities I lay out, five objectives I say, one, domestic transformation, particularly improving military preparedness and affecting an industrial policy. Second, the neighborhood, and ensuring a sort of more integrated neighborhood that benefits from access to India and proximity to India, but also becomes more stable, politically stable over time. Third, maintaining a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, and which has been upset by China's very rapid rise and assertiveness. Fourth, I think there are both opportunities and challenges to India's West, which are quite unique. Some of it has to do with the legacy of partition between India and Pakistan, but there are also now growing opportunities given a lot of the changes, political, demographic, technological, and economic changes in the Middle East, which these opportunities did not exist a decade or two ago. So I think seizing those opportunities more fully to integrate India eventually to the Mediterranean and onto Europe. And fifth and finally, I think there's an opportunity for reforming multilateral governance. Many of the institutions that define today's multilateral architecture were really legacies of the immediate post-World War II period or the Cold War. But today there's an opportunity both to reinvigorate and reform some of those institutions, to create new ones, and the Quad is a good example of that, but not the only one. And then I think India also, can position itself very valuably in the global South and as a sort of in between, as a medium between the global North and the global South.
And with that, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for a great and really, truly informative conversation. Thank you, Dhruva Jaishankar, Executive Director of ORF America, for joining us from Washington, D.C. Let's now turn to one of India's biggest and arguably most effective soft powers, movies. Most people have heard of Bollywood, but that's just one part of India's behemoth film industry. The country produces the highest number of movies in the world every year. India cinema researcher Wei-wen has written the book India Through Movies. It's the first Chinese language book on Indian cinema. Connected Subham Pal asked the Taiwanese author what inspired her to take a front row seat in the world of Indian cinema.
Because first, I like exotic culture, especially about India. But unfortunately, in Taiwan, people get something from the news or short video in the internet. It's very one-side vision, and they didn't see the whole and fair India. So based in my love to this country, I think I should have one book, tell Taiwan people what exactly is the India face, because India has many faces. So we need to have more time and more information to know about India.
How is Indian cinema perceived in Taiwan?
Long time ago, they will think Indian movie always need take 3-4 hours. It's too long for us. And they have so many dancing, singing. So this part for Taiwan people is not very used to be their experience for movie. But after I think 2008, because the Amir Khan's movie Three Idiots, that one is huge successful in Taiwan. So I think maybe over 80 people they know Indian movie about Three Idiots. They also think that is very good and start to know the India movie, not only the love story, dancing, and luxury, the places, something. They also have real touch, the real life. So right now, more and more people know Indian movie have many different faces.
What were some of the key challenges you faced while researching and writing about Indian cinema, given the cultural and linguistic differences between India and Taiwan?
The one thing is many nouns, they have different spell or different names in India because South India or North India is different. For example, like the god, you know the Murugan. Murugan is South India, which Shiva's son, right? But in North India, they will call like Skanda. So I need take many time to double check they are same thing, same people, or different. So that is one challenge. But fortunately, I am a history teacher. So when I see the India movie, the some story, get I can get it very easy. I will to pick my experience, like I read book or I went to India several times. So my experience will help me to know what is the movie really want to say. So maybe this part I am be better with other Taiwan people. That's why I can use very simpler words to tell the readers why the movie will shooting like this.
And we've just heard from Wei-wen, Indian cinema researcher and writer of India through movies. Thank you for watching. It has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, do join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.